The conference so far, I think, has gone very well. It's very interdisciplinary. We've heard from a physicist, we've heard from a neurobiologist, psychologist, Hindu scholar, Buddhist scholars, and so on. So I think it's very rich in terms of the diversity of perspectives. But there's always a gain and loss, and that is when we bring in so many perspectives, then the danger is that neither one gets to be explored very deeply. And so I think the strength of this is the diversity. The weakness is that there's sometimes a lack of depth, of really probing more elaborately and with a panel that have greater specialization or expert knowledge in a particular field. But that would simply be another conference. So it's not a criticism of this one, but I think it would be maybe kind of the limitation of this one, whereas another one that was full of specialists wouldn't have this breadth. So I think we need them both, but also in a larger view, I think we need this type of conference first, to lay the big background and to draw in this diversity of specialists from science, philosophy, and related studies so that we see we actually can have a meaningful conversation, because that's not so obvious to a lot of people.
Sure.
In terms of identifying where we are in this type of dialogue and then dialogue leading to collaborative research, from my own perspective, I think we need to first of all take into account the past, and so a number of lectures, including my own, went back to medieval times, tracing at least certain elements of the development of Western science and so on, its interrelationship with Christianity. And so this gives us some context for understanding where we are, because we didn't just drop out of the sky. But also I think it's very important that we have a vision of where we might go from here, because if we don't have that vision, we're bound to just fall into the same ruts we've been in the past. And the ruts in the past have been largely, that is, here's a generalization, between religion and science, a confrontation between empiricism and authoritarianism. And that is in the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's a very strong reliance upon Scripture, whatever that Scripture may be, that there are some absolutes here that are simply not negotiable. And that's fine. That's as Wittgenstein might say, well, okay, that's one way to play the game. That's fine, but that makes it very difficult to have a very engaging and open-minded and self-critical dialogue, let alone research with science, which has no sacred cows of that sort, no writ, no holy writ, not from Einstein, not from Niels Bohr, not from anybody. Everything is open in principle to skeptical review. And so I think that creates something of a problem. It's not insurmountable, but it's certainly formidable, whereas in that type of interface, where we have Scripture kind of being the, well, in medieval philosophy being the handmaiden to theology, and then beneath philosophy, then empirical science. I think Buddhism has a strategy that is much more in principle concordant with science, of this primary emphasis on experience, reason as the backup for that, so reason now is the handmaiden of experience, and then Scripture, or authority on the bottom. But having said that, there are still very clearly very powerful religious elements, very spiritual elements in Buddhism. So I think one possibility here is that Buddhism might serve something of a mediating role. In this larger framework of religion and science, Buddhism is not clearly religion, simply. It's certainly not simply a science. It may have a mediating role. So as we are visionaries here, I think it would be really wonderful to expand our notion of what science is. As I was trying to argue this morning, expand our notion of what a naturalistic vision of reality is, to finally fully incorporate the subjective and not keep on trying to encapsulate it into some kind of an objective paradigm of, after all, mental phenomena are really something that makes perfectly good sense, higher order functions of neuronal configurations. And so I think if we expand the scope of the scientific vision of reality in terms of naturalism, expand the scope of scientific methodologies in that way, and then to introduce or reintroduce more of a self-critical attitude in religion, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, or anyone else, to restore a sense of true empiricism in, let's say, spiritual traditions, contemplative traditions. I think what I look for is win-win situations, and I think that is exactly one, that everyone winds up being healthier and more open and restoring the vitality of their own tradition without it being co-opted by another one.
Okay.
I think Thupten Jimbo was making a really vital point here, because as we've seen in a number of conferences, even recent ones, there is a tendency, and sometimes it's an unimpeded tendency, to co-opt another tradition. Now we scientists really know what's going on in Buddhist meditation, because we found that there are these synchronous firings of neuronal networks all over the brain, and now we know what's really going on. If you think I'm referring to Wolf Singer, I don't think he's such a crass reductionist, but one could very easily read his comments in that regard. Or we see meditation is really beneficial because it helps psoriasis, or it helps depression, it's good for preventing heart attacks. Now we know what meditation is really good for. This is a complete hegemony, or kind of ideological imperialism from one type of paradigm, which was pointed out this morning, is in many respects very different from, I think Mark Sidorus is making this point, that the agendas, the paradigms of Buddhism or the contemplative traditions are quite different. Now, are they so different, they're commensurable, such that they don't even have anything to say to each other? Well, I think we've demonstrated in the last few days that's not the case. We are listening, we are learning, we're already engaging in collaboration, certainly by dialogue, but also by empirical research. And we're just starting, so I think we need to be very modest here that the type of experiments that we can do that do not co-opt one tradition by another are going to be on the level of Galileo and not M theory or quantum field theory. We have to be very, very modest here and ask small questions. This has been the great success of science. Galileo wasn't trying to figure out 11 dimensions of physical reality. He was trying to find out whether balls rolling down ramps accelerate or have constant velocity. He wasn't satisfied with that, but it's because of asking small questions that are answerable. We may eventually develop a true science, a contemplative science of mind, that it's richly drawing on psychology and neuroscience, but equally richly in a completely kind of a peer kind of relationship, equally drawing on the self-understanding, as Tripton Jinpa was emphasizing, a self-understanding of these contemplative traditions, so that no one is co-opting another. Pete and I are old friends, and we do share a lot, I think, in our general orientation. He's a professionally trained scientist with a lot of interest in Buddhism and meditation. I would say I'm a professionally trained Buddhist contemplative and teacher with a lot of interest in science. But taking this long view, envisioning science 30,000 years from now, I think that was a very healthy kind of thing to do, to kick us out of complacency, a feeling, well, after all, we really pretty much know what's going on. After all, everything, of course, boils down to the physical. Even though we don't really know what the physical is, give us 50 years. 50 years, says Antonio Damasio, and he was suggesting, oh, by then we'll really have figured out the nature of the mind in terms of its biological substrate. This is sheer conjecture. This is like 50 years, maybe the Messiah will come. 50 years, Santa Claus will materialize. I mean, why be thinking about 50 years? And why assume, as many, I think, neuroscientists do, that 20th century physics really has nothing to tell us that is important about brain function? Why should we rest on physics of the horse and buggy era, as if that has everything from physics that we need to know about mind-brain interaction? In terms of a hypothesis of the future, and Pete and I have already been discussing this, we correspond by email, is I see two parallel problems that are both enormously important, and they may be solved in an entangled fashion. And that is, for science today, I agree with John Searle and a number of others to say the problem of consciousness now is really paramount. What is the nature of this phenomena, which is so central to all of human existence? There's one problem, and it's not solved. And anybody who says we already know, this is what everybody intelligent person knows, it's hubris. It's an illusion of knowledge. So there's one. But there's another very tenacious problem in quantum mechanics, and it's called the measurement problem. And that is, before a measurement takes place, you have an undifferentiated world of probabilities, and it's complete abstraction. It's field, it's equations. And somehow, by the act of measurement, in which the observer, the participant, is crucial to setting up the experimental design and making the measurement, in some sense of the term, the participant can no longer be excluded from the physicist's understanding of physical reality. And in this transition from a pure probability function, an abstraction, a world of potentiality, undifferentiated, with no things in it, to a world of actuality, the role of the observer, the role of the participant is crucial, and we don't know what it is. So we have the problem of consciousness, we have the role of the observer. Gee, maybe they're related. And so that's my strong hypothesis, is that these two the solution to these two may come not just by physicists, because they are not professionally trained to understand consciousness, or the role of the observer, the participant. That's not their training. Their training is objective inquiry. But psychologists, neuroscientists, contemplatives, philosophers, this is where I set up my lattice model of knowledge with consciousness at the center. If all of these can be in a dialogue without any idols, without any totem, without any hierarchy, and saying we're all approaching this from a perspective of humility, how can we understand this together? Maybe we'll collaboratively and simultaneously solve or gain much greater understanding of the nature of consciousness and the role of the observer in bringing about physical reality. That would be quite an epiphany for the scientists, the contemplatives, the philosophers, and the mathematicians, all of us together.